Ya están en vivo.
Muy buenos días a todas y todos. Es un gusto para la Facultad de Arquitectura de la UNAM darle la bienvenida a Teddy Cruz y Fonna Forman en esta mañana de, eh, de primavera ya, mañana primaveral. La razón de esta reunión tiene que ver con el seminario de titulación Estudio RX que manejará a lo largo de 3 años el tema de migración, un tema candente, sobra decirlo, y vamos a tener pues varias actividades alrededor de estos temas. No solo el seminario de titulación Estudio RX lleva el tema, en el taller José Villagrán es un tema transversal para este semestre, lo están trabajando desde hace unos meses. Incluso la propia facultad está trabajando el tema. Hace unos días estuvieron en Ixtepec, en Oaxaca, en el albergue Hermanos en el Camino del Padre Solá Linde. Estuvieron colegas, estuvo Ada Bendaño, nuestra coordinadora de servicio social, con los profesores Judith Melendres y Pablo Landa, viendo temas relacionados con esta temática. El estudio RX va a trabajar este semestre en Tapachula, en la frontera con Guatemala, muy cerca de Arriaga, en Chiapas, de donde parte la Bestia, el tren que lleva a muchos migrantes de sur a norte de la República. Y bueno, vamos a tener la suerte de compartir hoy con Teddy Cruz y Fonna Forman temas que ellos también han manejado. Le agradezco a todo el equipo de Estudio RX, a Loreta Castro, a Gaby Carrillo, a Gonzalo Mendoza, Alberto Bolaños, William Brickman y Gustavo Iturbe, porque ellos son los que están planteando esta actividad. Y le dejo la palabra entonces a Loreta. Bienvenidos, Teddy, bienvenida, Fonna. Adelante, Loreta.
Muchas gracias, director.
Gracias.
Es un enorme placer para nosotros, para el Estudio RX, poder compartir con todos nuestros alumnos y con toda la facultad esta charla de Teddy Cruz y Fonna Forman. Y sin tomarme más tiempo, los voy a presentar. Teddy Cruz es profesor de Cultura Pública y Urbanismo en el Departamento de Artes Visuales de la Universidad de California en San Diego y director de Investigación Urbana en el Centro de Justicia Global de la Universidad de San Diego, California. Es reconocido internacionalmente por su investigación urbana en la frontera Tijuana-San Diego, trabajando sobre los asentamientos fronterizos como lugares de producción cultural, desde los que se puede repensar la política urbana, la vivienda asequible y el espacio público. Y Fonna Forman es profesora de Teoría Política en la Universidad de California en San Diego y directora fundadora del Centro de Justicia Global de dicha universidad. Es reconocida por su trabajo sobre justicia climática, urbanización, ciudadanía y fronteras equitativas, temas súper relevantes a nivel mundial. Durante 4 años trabajó en la Comisión Global de Ciudadanía de las Naciones Unidas, aconsejando en políticas de derechos humanos del siglo XXI. Actualmente funge como copresidenta del Consejo de Liderazgo Climático Global de la Universidad de California. Teddy y Fonna tienen un estudio juntos. Es una práctica de investigación sobre arquitectura y política ubicada en San Diego, California. Su trabajo combina los campos de la arquitectura y el urbanismo, la teoría política y la normatividad urbana, las artes visuales y la cultura pública. Encabezan una variedad de propuestas de investigación e intervenciones cívico-públicas en la región fronteriza Tijuana-San Diego, incluyendo las estaciones comunitarias de la Universidad de California en San Diego, una red de espacios públicos transfronterizos codesarrollados entre la universidad y una comunidad de investigación y enseñanza colaborativa sobre pobreza y equidad social. Entre 2012 y 2014 fueron consejeros especiales de la Universidad de San Diego y encabezaron su laboratorio de innovación cívica. Su trabajo se ha exhibido de manera extensiva en recintos culturales de todo el mundo, incluyendo el MoMA de Nueva York, el Centro de Artes Hierbabuena en San Francisco, el Museo Nacional de Diseño Cooper Hewitt en Nueva York, la Casa de Culturas del Mundo en Berlín, M+ en Hong Kong, la Bienal de Urbanismo y Arquitectura de Shenzhen en 2016 y la representación de Estados Unidos en la Bienal de Arquitectura de Venecia de 2018. Actualmente cuentan con 3 monografías que están por publicarse, 2 por MIT Press y una por la editorial Verso. Y pues les damos muchísimas gracias, Teddy, Fonna, por estar aquí en la Facultad de Arquitectura de la UNAM, aunque lejanos, esperando poderlos tener cerca pronto. Y pues les dejamos la palabra.
Thank you so much, Loretta.
Muchísimas gracias, Loretta.
For that wonderful introduction, and thank you all. Apologies in advance, and thank you for indulging our presentation today in English. Thank you so much. So Teddy and I are excited to be here with you to discuss our research-based practice embedded at the San Diego-Tijuana border. We see this zone as a microcosm of all of the injustices and indignities experienced by vulnerable people across the globe: political violence, climate disruption, accelerating migration, rising nationalism, border building everywhere, deepening inequality, and the steady decay of public thinking. We live and work just a few miles from the child detention centers that will forever stain this period of American history. San Diego-Tijuana has become a lightning rod for American nativism. And although the news cameras are gone, tens of thousands of Central American and Haitian migrants wait at the wall for asylum that never comes, reviled often by the Mexican public as a nuisance, an infestation, or else they sit in US detention centers as tools of deterrence, separated until recently forcibly from their children and exposed to a raging pandemic. It's been particularly devastating in recent years to witness the emotional impact on children, their fear, and the inevitable psychic internalization of being socially and morally marginalized. Hopefully, there's relief on the horizon. It really remains to be seen. But the prospect of more border porosity in the coming period is drawing even more people north. And climate change will inevitably accelerate these flows in the years to come. A recent United Nations survey found that 72% of arriving migrants at the US southern border are agricultural workers, and that agricultural instability was a major factor in their decision to walk north. So global justice is an intensely local dynamic here. Now, against these local atrocities, border communities and activists on both sides of the wall continue to confront and productively circumvent unjust power. Some of this contestation is about sanctuary and protecting people targeted by the state. Some of it is working through the courts, detention centers, and other institutions of power to advocate for people who are already ensnared in the net of political violence. Some of it takes the shape of bottom-up civic agency that exposes and counters unjust power, confronts hateful political narratives, and transgresses boundaries. And much of it arises informally through everyday collective practices of adaptation and resilience in conditions of scarcity and danger. Over the years, Teddy and I have accompanied some of these bottom-up sort of emancipatory transgressions, eruptions of democratic will from below, in close partnership with agencies at the front lines. In recent years, these struggles have also attracted artists and cultural producers to the border region from around the world to engage in acts of performative protest. We have been largely critical of this sort of uptick in ephemeral cultural action that dips in and out of the conflict. It tends to be extractive in its process, and the impact on public consciousness as leading as the Instagram posts it generates. What happens the day after the happening, right? So instead, we've been advocating for a longer view of resistance, a more systemic approach to the drivers of injustice, and more strategic thinking about cultural, institutional, and spatial transformation in the border region. These commitments have culminated in a project that we'd like to share with you this morning, the Ucsd Community Stations. They're a network of public spaces located in vulnerable neighborhoods across the border region, where universities and communities meet to share knowledges and resources and to collaborate on research, dialogue, cultural and educational activities, as well as urban design build projects in the city. The community stations really serve as the field-based sort of social engagement arm of our research-based practice located inside the university. So we localize the global. We've always resisted the idea that global justice is something that happens out there in the world somewhere. Living and working where we do, we don't need to send our students far away to learn about territorial conflict, migration, poverty, and climate justice. We're minutes away from an international in crisis, and this enables an amazing proximity between campus and field, between theory and practice, what we like to think of as a critical proximity. Of course, going local here means recognizing ourselves as a region, a site of interdependence. Despite the wall and the ugly political rhetoric that's been designed to divide us, we are a binational ecology of flows and circulation, and our future here is intertwined. Air, water, waste, health, culture, money, hope, love. These things don't stop at walls. Through the community stations, we are committed to building what we think of as a cross-border citizenship culture, a sense of belonging that is not defined by the nation state or the documents that you carry in your pocket, but the shared interests and aspirations among people who inhabit a violently disrupted civic space. Those who benefit from narratives of separation and mistrust prefer that we remain fragmented here, that the idea of citizenship divides us rather than unites us. We are seeking to inspire more inclusive imaginaries of citizenship, coexistence in this contested territory. Our cultural aspirations are inspired by Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal and a 20th century lineage of Latin American civic experimentation and urban pedagogy. In contexts of dramatic violence and social fragmentation, cities like Porto Alegre, Brazil, Bogota, and Medellin, Colombia, sought to heal the wounds of history and mobilize a cohesive civic identity through participatory cultural action. We have partnered over the years with some of the key civic actors in these now legendary urban case studies to understand their cultural strategies and processes, and we've carried their lessons back with us to the border region as we conceptualized the community stations. One of these was our collaboration in 2015 with the former mayor of Bogota, Antanas Mockus. When Mockus became mayor in 1995, Bogota was falling apart because of poverty, corruption, and complete sort of urban breakdown. He insisted that before transforming the city physically with architecture and infrastructure, we needed first to transform social norms, public trust, and social cooperation from the bottom up, really to change, hearts and minds. He deployed cultural strategies like street mimes, urban games, and theatrical public disruptions to cultivate what he called a new citizenship culture. It's a beautiful idea, to restitch that troubled city back together, both vertically, right, and horizontally. Later, we brought Mockus to the San Diego-Tijuana border to collaborate with us, a survey project to investigate the idea of a cross-border citizenship culture in this violently disrupted zone, where citizenship, again, always divides and never unites. There's no space to explore this project here now, but it's important that this social research continues to animate all of our work seeking to identify and visualize the shared values, interests, and common norms artificially disrupted zone. Is there something like a cross-border citizen, a regional public sensibility that crosses the line? Now, a second collaboration was with the former mayor of Medellin, Colombia, Sergio Fajardo, in a city that was considered at the time the most dangerous city on the planet. Fajardo declared that the root of violence, is inequality, and he vowed to transform Medellin into the most educated city in Colombia. Violence limits opportunities, he said. Knowledge and social inclusion open them up. The now famous Library Parks project was his response, transforming urban remainders into civic spaces for dialogue, urban pedagogy, and cultural production. While the architectural world was celebrating the buildings, the physical works in Medellin, few were talking about the institutional transformations that were required for such a massive undertaking. So we partnered with Fajardo and Colombian architect Alejandro Echeverri to develop a visualization project called the Medellin Diagram to document Medellin's innovative political, civic, and spatial processes. From this, we developed a set of process-based visualizations and cartographies that could translate Medellin's creative public management as lessons for the world. One concept that still remains extremely useful to us from this work is the idea that public space educates. Medellin convened fragmented institutions across the city, designing cross-sector coalitions among universities, NGOs, government, industry, civic philanthropy, and community leaders to co-produce educational and cultural programming. It was a transversal curatorial project that designed physical systems in tandem with pedagogical support systems to enable civic activity, education, vocational training, cultural production, and small-scale economic development. So these coalitions were tasked with injecting the physical space project with management protocols, funding streams, and civic engagement to ensure sustainability. So like Medellin, we are rethinking public space as a site for constructing a new civic imagination, a new citizenship culture. We reject conventional strategies of urban beautification and innovation that turn our public spaces into sites of leisure and consumption, which only accelerate gentrification. We believe public space must become civicized. It's a beautiful word. James Tully uses this word all of the time in his work. A site of dialogue and contestation, and infused with resources and tools to increase public knowledge and community capacity for political and environmental action. These commitments have really tested our community stations with their civic potential. So now a tour of the community stations and just a hint about what happens inside of them.
Yes, for us, the urban ecological justice is a distributed concept, requiring not only the redistribution of resources, but also the redistribution of knowledges. We designed this reciprocal knowledge infrastructure as both a collaborative education platform and a model for shared urban intervention. In fact, we claimed that the economic and programmatic power of our public university can be leveraged for communities to develop their own public spaces and social housing. As a distributed system of public spaces transgressing the wall, the community stations spatialize social justice, mobilizing cross-border citizenship culture through cultural action. With our community partners, we have co-developed 4 community stations, 2 in San Diego, 2 in Tijuana. So let's move from north to south. The Ucsd Earth Lab community station is a partnership with Groundwork San Diego, an environmental justice nonprofit located in the low-income, primarily Black and Latino neighborhoods of Encanto, a community characterized by high unemployment, low educational attainment, food insecurity, and cyclical poverty. The station occupies a 4-acre vacant parcel owned by the San Diego Unified School District, who granted the parcel to our partnership to increase educational capacity for the 8 public schools within walking distance of the site. This access to municipal land gave us leverage to assemble a unique cross-sector collaboration between a major research university where we teach, a local school district, and a grassroots organization to co-develop public space, placing education at the center of community development. Before COVID-19 hit, 3,000 kids and their families circulated through the Earth Lab each year, and during the current transition, it continues to operate as an outdoor socially distanced classroom. With our community partners and local school teachers, we are designing an experiential environmental pedagogical method to open doors for local youth to see themselves reflected in the environment, understanding that the care for nature resembles the care for each other and the care for their own community. The school district has committed capital monies now towards a more refined physical resolution of the site for what has so far largely remained an informal effort. While Ucsd, our university, will invest in sustainable educational programming, research, and management in collaboration with Grantworks San Diego, our community partners, who will steward community participation. Pedagogic zones at the site will be focused on habitat restoration through energy, water, food, and community programs, all surrounded by indigenous Kumeyaay knowledges and environmental practices. Ultimately, the Ucsd Earth Lab Community Station will perform as an open-air climate action park designed for environmental education and climate justice. The school district has also committed school bond funding for a new climate action design building to anchor the site and as a pilot for post-COVID porosity in classroom design. This station will break ground in 2023. Moving south, the Ucsd Casa community station is a partnership with the nonprofit organization Casa Familiar, a 30-year-old community-based social service organization. It is located in the border neighborhood of San Isidro, site of the busiest land crossing in the Western Hemisphere. The community is 90% Latino and has one of the highest unemployment rates, lowest median household income, and worst air quality in San Diego County. The heart of this community station is a beloved historic church that sat for decades in disrepair and which we were able to rescue through this project with our partners. You can see the church levitating because we needed to restore its foundations, and having this church elevated like a ghost with Tijuana's informal settlements in the distance was an incredibly inspirational image for this community that has been targeted by the state with such criminalization in the last years. The heart, in other words, of this community station is a beloved historic church that sat for decades in disrepair. With the adaptive reuse of this historic building as catalyst, we designed the Ucsd Casa Community Station as a double project, a parcel-size social infrastructure made of spaces for cultural, economic activity is flanked by affordable housing. We renovated the historic church into a community theater. Sorry, I'm losing the thread here. In reality, what I wanted to say is that this composition of having an infrastructure for social and cultural support being flanked by affordable housing was also a strategic way of organizing financial streams to support the project, which really supported each of the building typologies by different foundations, by our universities, and municipal subsidies to make the entire economic package work. We renovated the historic church into a community theater with an outdoor stage. This performance space is flanked on one side by a series of small accessory buildings for Casa Familiar's social programming, and on the other side by an open-air civic pavilion. This social, educational, and cultural infrastructure anchors 10 units of affordable housing at both ends of the parcel, all mediated by pedestrian walkways. We completed construction of this station in February, just before COVID-19 hit, and the residents moved in. It has been locked down during the last months, but it is a site that we designed for social proximity. So we are returning now in person to produce and co-develop cultural programming with our partners. What is important, though, to say here is that affordable housing takes on a different meaning when it is deliberately threaded into spaces for social programming, summoning residents to participate in the development of social economy, cultural production, synergizing spaces, programs, resources, and people. This is an integrated social-spatial system that is programmed between the university and the community. So let's imagine a small coalition of local artists, promotoras, and neighborhood youth collaborating with university curators, theater script writers, and visual artists who come together periodically to co-produce a play, a theater play in the community theater. These artistic productions are rooted in neighborhood stories and become bottom-up evidentiary material to increase public knowledge for policy transformation. So before moving across the border to show you the community stations there, allow me to pause for a moment to summarize a couple of concepts and share how these processes behind our 2 San Diego-based stations exemplify several core commitments or building blocks, as we call them, of our practice. First, that in conditions of poverty, housing needs to be embedded in an infrastructure of social, economic, and cultural support. In other words, we must rethink affordable housing from autonomous units into relational social systems. Housing must be public infrastructure. Density should not be measured as an abstract number of objects or people per area. Density must be understood instead as the intensity of social and economic exchanges per area. Migrant neighborhoods have taught us that these exchanges, mobilized by bottom urbanization, is the DNA for democratizing the city into more inclusive and plural environments. Zoning must stop being punitive, preventing socialization. Instead, it should be conceptualized as a generative tool that anticipates, stimulates, and organizes social and economic activity in neighborhoods. The developer's pro forma is architecture's financial plastic. Inside the mathematics of this spreadsheet, our services as architects amounts to 15% of a project's construction costs. This undercapitalized asset can be mobilized as collateral for development. Nothing should prevent architects from becoming developers of our own projects. And by association, nothing should prevent communities from doing the same. So what we're trying to say is that we must co-develop with communities. The sweat equity of architects, cultural producers and community leaders, the economic equity of public universities, and municipal protocols for accessing public lands can be all bundled, aggregated to enable communities to develop their own neighborhoods. That truly has been our story. So moving now across the border, our 2 community stations in Tijuana are located in the Laureles Canyon, an informal settlement adjacent to the border wall. I will take a few moments just to describe this incredible context. And I think because of the reason of time, we are going to share maybe only one community station. This location is at an important juncture of conflict. Here, the topography of Tijuana's canyon clashed with the border wall before spilling northbound into an environmentally protected estuary in San Diego, which is now layered with security infrastructure. At this hotspot, the conflict between natural and jurisdictional systems and between ecological and political priorities is profound. As we zoom in further, we witness a collision between the estuary in the US, the border wall, and the informality of Laureles Canyon, which is home to 92,000 people. This aerial video shows Laureles Canyon and the precarious condition of the informal settlement that has sprawled on the slopes. This site sits 30 minutes from our campus and demonstrates the dramatic proximity of wealth and extreme poverty in our region. Laureles Canyon is impacted by dump sites, drastic erosion, flooding, and landslides. And all of this is exacerbated by the dramatic precipitation fluctuations of climate change. Because Laureles Canyon lacks water and waste management infrastructure to mitigate these impacts, much of the trash, along with tons of sediment, flows downstream, ending in the estuary in San Diego, contaminating this bioregional and shared binational asset. Here, the border wall is an artifact of environmental insecurity, as all the trash ends up in this environmental zone. These impacts have intensified in recent years because of the profound lack of collaboration between San Diego and Tijuana to manage these cross-border flows. In the last decades, 70% of the open lands in Laureles Canyon have been lost to irregular urban growth. We have been identifying and bundling unsquatted lands in the settlement that are still environmentally rescuable to shape an archipelago of conservation. We are advancing an ambitious regional project called the Cross-Border Commons, an environmental conservation initiative that links the estuary in the US with the informal settlement in Mexico, forming a continuous social and ecological envelope that transgresses the wall and protects the environmental systems shared between these two border cities. With our Tijuana partners, we are curating a coalition of state and municipal agencies, grassroots organizations, and universities on both sides of the wall. And we are now negotiating with the municipality to gain access to the remaining public lands inside the informal settlement. Another important contextual note before we introduce you one of the Tijuana stations is that Laureles Canyon has also been the site where we have been advancing our research on informal urbanization. As we have written about over many years, the informal settlements of Tijuana are built with urban waste from San Diego, recycling architectural parts to construct habitation and infrastructure. We have learned a great deal from these incremental building practices as people construct their own shelter in layers over time. In a case study we documented before, a metal frame appeared from one day to another. In a couple of months, recycled materials began to thread the spaces, and in the next weeks, an informal house emerged. We have also taken note that multinational maquiladoras surrounding these informal settlements typically benefit from easy access to cheap labor. Over the years, we have experimented with factory-made material systems to structurally mediate the recycling of waste. We have proposed an ethical loop where factories invest in emergency housing. So here we are inside Mecalux, a Spanish maquiladora that produces lightweight metal shelving systems for global export, adapting its prefabricated structures into structural scaffolds as armatures for informal housing. We designed a catalog with the factory's engineers to test a variety of prototypes and configurations. The first Mecalux typology is shown here with adapted recycled urban waste from San Diego, illustrating how top-down institutional resources must support the bottom-up creative intelligence of informal urbanization. A couple of years ago, we built the first example, and being inside the factory, redirecting its material systems and surplus value to sites of emergency was an important milestone in our research-based practice. So it was important to introduce you briefly to these contextual processes because our two community stations in Tijuana operate within this rich ecology of social, environmental, economic, and material relations and partnerships. So now we will share one of those stations. The Ucsd Alacran community station is located in the most rugged, precarious, and polluted sub-basin of the canyon. It is a partnership with Embajadores de Jesus, a religious organization led by activist pastor economist Gustavo Banda Aceves and pastor psychologist Zaida Guillen. With limited resources, they began a construction of a refugee camp to provide shelter, food, and basic services to hundreds of Haitian and Central American refugees while they navigate unjust asylum processes in the US and Mexico. And with the help of skilled migrants, they began building their own emergency housing. We have now established a long-term partnership to co-develop a community station here to increase refugee housing capacity. So we are now accelerating the production of Mechalux frames to install them on vernacular post and beam concrete systems to shape housing infrastructures. The housing scaffolds will be built first, leaving the interiors as planned open systems, equipped with utilities to support incremental live-work configurations. These envelopes are the seeds for an evolving sanctuary neighborhood to be infilled through time by the migrant residents themselves. We see migrant housing as a mechanism for generating jobs. So in order to sustain the construction process over time, we have designed what we are calling a sanctuary economy. We embed refugee housing in the spaces of fabrication, training, small-scale economic development. So with the support of the Park Foundation, we have assembled a community-owned business, the Little Haiti Construction Company, with a tool library, wood and metal machines, and a couple of trucks and tractors. The immigrant community will complete construction of the site and remain operational for future construction jobs across the canyon through this cooperative. So the UCS Alacran Community Station began construction last summer. The migrant community assembled the adapted shelving systems into housing frames, but also we began healing the topography, creating hydrofiltration channels and gabion walls, terracing and water collection systems, advancing migrant housing as an ecological restorative infrastructure. This is a seed project for, again, as I mentioned, an evolving sanctuary ecological neighborhood. The sanctuary ecological neighborhood will be exemplary how to develop the future of this informal settlement, integrating social and environmental justice issues, a laboratory for rethinking the city at large in terms of a more integrated and inclusive idea of urban ecology. So we work here with community leaders, students, and researchers on social protection from landslides, floods, and estuary health beyond the wall. We lead educational programming through which young people understand zones of vulnerability in their own neighborhoods, emphasizing ecological conservation of species and habitat restoration. It's never too early to begin. We have committed to elevating children here as the cross-border citizens of the future. So our two Tijuana-based stations have also advanced important building blocks for our practice, two in particular. First, for us, the informal is not just an aesthetic category, but a praxis, a dynamic set of functional urban operations from below that counter and transgress the imposition of top-down political power and exclusionary economic models. And hospitality, even though it is the first gesture when the immigrant arrives, an essential charitable opening, a first step in creating a more welcoming society. But as needs become more complex over time, charity is not the appropriate model for building an inclusive society. We need to move from hospitality into inclusion. So thinking beyond shelter is a foundation for rethinking refugee camps everywhere, from places of short-term habitation and service provision to durable infrastructures for inclusion. Migrant shelters, in other words, can be agile for negotiating both transition and rootedness, the ephemeral and the permanent.
So these are the 4 UCSD community stations. There's So much more to say about them, about our amazing partners and what we do together in these spaces. While they all focus on different issues that reflect, the priorities and challenges of each of the communities, they're all richly curated for dialogue, collaborative research, urban pedagogy, participatory design build, and cultural production. And they all aspire to increasing public knowledge, challenging divisive political narratives, fostering solidarity, and advancing strategies to counter exploitation, dispossession, deportation, and environmental calamity. Now, these activities often invite encounters with formal institutions of power that govern the border zone. Sometimes these meetings facilitate mutual recognition and cooperation, and sometimes they don't. For us, the goal is less about resolving conflict than democratizing it. We see democracy in the border zone as a fundamentally bottom-up process of exposing and rendering more accessible the complex histories and mechanisms of injustice that are too often hidden within official accounts of who we are in this border region. Racist political narratives in the United States portray the border as a site of rupture and criminality, but we have been committed to generating different stories, counter narratives about life in this region that are grounded in the experiences of people who live here, who inhabit this zone. We are a region of flow and circulation, shared practices and aspirations, alliances of hearts and minds, despite the wall that physically restricts the movement of so many bodies. In this sense, the community stations become a sort of cross-border observatory, right? A platform for constructing what we think of as an elastic civic identity from the bottom, a sort of cross-border res publica. With our partners, we curate unwalling experiments, experiments that dissolve the wall using visual tools like diagrams and radical cartographies to situate border neighborhoods within broader spatial ecologies of circulation and interdependence, from local to regional to continental and ultimately to global scales. We see elasticity as a civic skill, the ability to stretch, turn between local and more expansive ways of thinking, to understand one's challenges within broader dynamics and processes, and to invent possibilities for collaboration across walls. Here at the border, as Teddy mentioned a few minutes ago, the idea of the bioregion, the binational watershed system, has been a powerful imaginary for activating more elastic civic thinking. Several years ago, we curated a cross-border public action through one of the sewage drains that Homeland Security in the US carved beneath the wall between the Larelas Canyon and the Tijuana River estuary that Teddy introduced you to. We negotiated a permit with the US, transformed the drain into an official port of entry southbound for 24 hours. They agreed. They were disarmed by our self-description as just artists, as long as Mexican immigration was willing on the other side to stamp our passports. So here, our convoy was comprised of 300 local activists, residents, representatives from the municipalities of San Diego and Tijuana, artists and border activists from across the world. We summoned agencies that are typically at odds with one another. And as we moved together southward under the wall, we witnessed the wastewater and plastics moving northbound toward the estuary beneath our feet. This strange crossing from slum, from estuary to slum through a kind of militarized culvert, and the stamping of passports on the other side amplified the most profound interdependencies of this border region. The insight here was that protecting the vulnerable US estuary demands shared investment in the informal Mexican settlement. So in this experiment, we went down, right under, but sometimes nurturing civic elasticity requires ascending above. So imagine a Mexican child standing right here, high above the border wall on a narrow sliver of land on the eastern rim of the Laureles Canyon, right here at a place called Mirador. So imagine she plants her feet facing due west with the Pacific Ocean in front of her, Mexico to her left, the US to her right. Below, to her immediate left, she sees the dense informal settlement where she lives. She can spot her house, her school, and experience their proximity to a country that she and her family are not permitted to enter. Below, to her immediate right, almost directly beneath her feet, she sees the border wall, which from this vantage looks like a flimsy and ridiculous strip inserted into a vast and powerful natural rhythm. Lifting her eyes, she sees the green expanse of the Tijuana River estuary with its wetland habitats and sediment basins, these brown basins that are contrived to catch the northbound flow of waste from her community. And further beyond still, you can't see it in this photo, downtown San Diego rising vertically to the sky. So from this vantage, all of the characters of this contested zone to life, we've witnessed this moment of recognition again and again over the years among children, our students, even university presidents. There are few places on earth where the collision of informality, militarization, environmental vulnerability, and the proximity of extreme wealth and poverty can be so vividly experienced. But in reality, the conflicts that we experience here locally between the nation and nature are reproduced again and again across the entire trajectory of the continental border between the United States and Mexico. Over the years, we've collected aerial photos like these that document precise moments when the jurisdictional line collides with natural systems, powerfully illustrating what dumb sovereignty looks like when it hits the ground in a complex bioregion. Our next project stretches the elastic civic aspiration to a continental scale. Mexus visualized the entire border zone without the line. It dissolves the border into a bioregion whose shape is defined by the 8 binational watershed systems that flow across this bioregional territory. Mexus also exposes other systems, tribal nations, protected lands, croplands, urban crossings, many more informal ones, 15 million people. And ultimately, Mexus counters America's wall-building fantasies with more expansive imaginaries of belonging and cooperation beyond the nation state. Here it is in 2018 at the Venice Architecture Biennale. So in community stations programming, this Mexus visualization becomes an important provocation for dialogue about a shared bioregional civic identity among Mexicans, Americans, and the diverse tribal nations who inhabit this contested space. Now, the final civic stretch, literally, and the end of our talk, is a visualization project called the Political Equator, which traces an imaginary line from San Diego, Tijuana across the planet, forming a corridor of global conflict between the 30 and 38th miles north. Along this trajectory lie some of the world's most contested and violent thresholds. The US-Mexico border at San Diego, which is the most trafficked international border checkpoint in the Western Hemisphere, moving across the Strait of Gibraltar and the Mediterranean, the main route from North Africa into Forgotten Europe, the Israeli-Palestinian border that divides the Middle East, India, Kashmir, a site of intense and enduring territorial conflict between Pakistan and India since the British partition, the border between North and South Korea, presenting decades of intractable Cold War conflict, and China's accelerating militarization of the South China Sea, along with Taiwan and Hong Kong. Now, visualizing this political equator in red, alongside the climatic equator below in green, was an astonishing discovery for us, because the ribbon in between them, give or take a few degrees, contains the planet's most populous slums, its sites of greatest natural resource extraction and export, and its zones of greatest political instability, climate vulnerability, and human displacement. And when these parallel lines are applied to the Pierce-Quincunxial projection from above, the Arctic becomes protagonist, right? With its melting ice caps detonating hemispheric conflicts through sea level rise, dramatic coastal vulnerability, and human displacement. So in the end, the collision of nationalism and border building, climate catastrophe, and forced migration, it's the global injustice trifecta of our time. But as we said at the beginning, these dynamics always hit the ground somewhere and are experienced by people locally in everyday places like ours and like yours. Thank you so much for having us with you today.
And I was trying to listen. I hope it was, you know, it was choppy in terms of the sound. I hope it was okay on your end. I don't know if there was interruption or not, but I know it was a lot of information, but it was important for us to share with you the cross-section, the almost mystic cross-section across the scales and geographies and communities that we engaged. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Fonna and Teddy, for this super interesting lecture. I'm sure it raises a lot of questions and a lot of reflection mainly. So I would like to open the floor. Y me gustaría, chicos, los que estén escuchando tanto en redes sociales como los que están en la plataforma de Zoom, si tienen preguntas, que por favor los de Zoom pueden levantar la mano, los de redes sociales si las pueden poner en el chat y con mucho gusto se las versamos a Fonna y a Teddy. A ver, Quetzali. Si quieres, prende tu cámara.
Gracias. Well, Teddy, Fonna, thank you so much for this amazing presentation about your work. It's amazing how you've been working in the cross-border at north of my country. My first question is about the migration and the people who work in these places that have you been do for them. It's a complicated situation in my country, have work and migrants together in the same place, because they have a lot of forms and documents who need to do before he can have a work who pays who he want and humanity can be accepted. So it's still having these issues in your country, like having documentaries before they can work, or they have a different exercise, or I don't know, have your government give it the opportunity to work.
Fonna, do you want to take that first?
Sure. Well, look, this is a zone of labor exploitation. And just the economies of scale between the two countries are just astonishing. I mean, what a maquiladora worker earns in a day, a low wage earner in the United States earns in an hour. And so the proximity of this kind of exploitative labor practices across the border and the regulated, labor culture in the US is really dramatic. But the documentation, I mean, the result of this is that people who are moving north in search of work are exposed to that similar kind of exploitation in informal ways, because they don't have the documentation that's needed to work in the formal factory systems. So yeah, I mean, it's a terrible geopolitical problem. And what needs to happen is multinational collaboration on international labor rights, particularly for migrant populations. I mean, one of the challenges right now, in a very basic way, is that so many of the people that are coming north in search of work are leaving their homes. You know, the typical, you know, the typical story is that people migrate because of poverty and political instability. But what's happening now is those things are being exacerbated by climate change and agricultural instability. But there still is no language in the international refugee community to characterize climate migrants as international refugees. So they're not entitled to the same kinds of protections and access to resources that other kinds of refugees might have. This requires an entire geopolitical rethinking on the movement of peoples, because it's only accelerating, and it's going to continue accelerating. So, you know, the injustices that you're describing, Quetzali, not have an answer right now, and it's terrible.
Yeah, and Quetzali, this is maybe in the context of all the students who will be tackling this very complex problem. How do we design not only spaces? This is what one of our points here in the presentation. Not only spaces of refuge, of sanctuary, but also designing the protocols, designing the rights of access, designing the civic processes, potentially negotiating institutional accountability to really produce the kinds of mechanisms that allow, you know, for justice, in this case, labor justice or integration or inclusion to really be not only a symbolic, rhetorical kind of thing, but to really be operational. One incredible lesson that we received or we got from our conversations with our activist partners in Tijuana is exactly what Fonna was saying, is that not only we are defending the rights of the migrant to migrate because of political, you know, violence and climate change, etc. But now, as migrants were waiting at the border to get asylum that they never really ultimately were offered, the opening began to occur of rethinking rights, the rights of the migrant to migrate, but also the rights of the migrant to remain if they choose to. So part of the idea here is then how do we produce a framework, not only physical, but economic, job generation, inclusion, and so on. And this site is very interesting. Quetzali, I don't know if, you know, because again, we have been hugely masochistic because we've been trying to figure out how to engage institutions to acknowledge the sweat equity, not only of the informal, but really of migrants. After all, you know, the history of the city has always been constructed because of the use of migrant labor that then is disposed of, right? I mean, every single city in the world for that matter. And so here we have migrants that arrive to this canyon. The waste, as we showed, of sediment and trash crosses the border, contaminating the environmental zone that is a binational regional asset that we must collaboratively protect. The state of California spends $12 million cleaning that estuary. So part of our negotiation or argument with our partners in Tijuana has been, can some of that money be brought across the border to support job generation so migrants and the local informal communities can participate in habitat restoration projects in the canyon to prevent the contamination from polluting the environmental shared zone. Do you see what I'm trying to say? We're designing these sort of strange loops and interfaces across economic, social economy, political economy, shelter, spatialization, and collaboration across institutions. It's very difficult, but I'm saying that because as Fonna presents this as a geopolitical challenge, I think we could, in certain strategic sides, advance models to understand how we need to connect the dots and how we need to, even in a counterintuitive way, right? I mean, Americans thinking, what, am I going to invest in the Mexican informal settlement? This is what the United States should be doing right now, in fact. As they want to mitigate the flows of migrants coming from Central America, the United States, in collaboration with those governments, need to invest in social housing, infrastructure, the kinds of job generation that needs to happen at local geographies to prevent that flow, or at least to allow migrants to reconsider their own lives, I mean, in their own environment. So yes, that's a reason for us working at the border even though it's a complex geography, we always have said it to ourselves, it is border zones like this one that really these are the places from which we can rethink interdependence, coexistence. So these are the places to seek new strategies for cross-border collaboration.
Gracias. Thank you, Fonna, Teddy. We have some other questions. I'm going to read one from YouTube from Elis Mendoza. And she says, thank you, Teddy and Fonna, for an amazing talk. I was very interested in the refugee camp and the idea that instead of building for emergency, your project envisions an infrastructure for inclusion. Can you expand on the problematic of the camp in becoming a place for negotiations with the hosting community? How do you involve both them in the process?
You want to take that, Teddy?
A fundamental question, how to integrate the migrant in the civic life of a community, right? And again, in that process of integration, we also begin to rethink our own relationship to the city. So it's a mutual, it's not to say that it's just one directional, that we must, that's the reason we were saying this is about, it has to be about post-charity or post, hospitality. I think we can learn along each other. I mean, not only in the way we need to rethink the city as more resilient. I mean, we've been thinking a lot about it because particularly Fonna is very much involved, all of us here in issues of climate and how we transform, we can transform the cities into more resilient environments that absorb and withstand the impact of climate change. How can public spaces act in double ways, right? As absorbing flood and manage water potentially. But now maybe they also become environments for emergency, for social emergency. So the multiplicity and plurality of meanings that public space begin to now take is fundamental here. So yes, the migrant is helping us, let's put it this way, to reimagine our own communities. And that requires a huge kind of humility, not only as in terms of humanity at large, but also in terms of what Fonna calls an epistemic humility, right? That the solutions that we have provided are not the right ones. And we need to, both intellectually, but also architecturally and urbanistically. But that requires a major, final thing, political representation, social representation. All of those are systems that we could design as well. So with our partners, we have been, the community partners, our community partners are the hosts and the mediators. So the migrants have representation, and we need to be the ones. Architects could become the political representatives of migrants in the spatialization of their own context. Sorry, Fonna.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to say one thing, that this really ultimately is about changing perceptions of the migrant. I mean, this is a challenge we've been dealing with in the US for a long time. Migrants in sort of the conventional perception is they're a drain on resources, they're competing for jobs, they're competing for, limited access to resources. And so it's really entering into those biases and understanding that, migrants are actually beneficial to society. They bring value rather than extract value. And I think, it was really interesting actually to witness the way the city of Tijuana responded to the arrival of the Haitian migrants many years ago now, after the major earthquake, and this beautiful receptivity and welcoming. And it was very interesting from a kind of racial perspective because, Black Haitians were a new phenomenon in Tijuana, and the city just opened its arms. It was actually quite moving. It was a beautiful moment. And integrated particularly Haitian men into the society because women and children were getting across the border and weren't. So there was this massive sort of influx of Haitian in the city. The response to Central American migration has been met. The waves of migration coming northbound have been met with, sometimes overt hostility and fear and so on. So the question that was asked is really about how to change those perceptions of immigrant. And here, actually, the U.S. Has experienced this for a long time and may have something to say, to teach how to do that better. But anyway, it's an ongoing cultural challenge.
Thank you. We have another question from Enrique Barba here in Zoom. Enrique.
Yes, thank you. Well, first and foremost, I would like to emphasize on how enlightening your work and presentation have been. Thank you so much. And well, as Professor Loretta Castro mentioned earlier, our seminar seeks not only to provide design interventions in space and time, but rather to bring knowledge and visibility to a phenomenon such as migration. And amongst our first inclinations over research, we've insisted on the importance of not seeking to resolve a problem as architects usually do by imposing technological methods and how we build livable spaces, but rather how we can contribute while learning from and with migrants. And well, my question is, how has your experience been perceived by migrants inhabiting these interventions that you mentioned, and how are they perceived by the local communities who are not directly intertwined in these projects?
How are they perceived by the local community, right? This is
yeah,
and this is part of what I was beginning to maybe describe, the need for mediation, to intervene into new mediatory spaces for conflict resolution, where dialogical processes, and this is where images, where evidence, how we can produce evidence about the kinds of interdependencies we want to advance. Because eventually, when we are talking about restoring the habitat, let's say in that informal settlement, that archipelago of conservation, it's about improving the quality of life, not only of migrants, but of all communities. And so I think that to understand, which already is embedded in some of those communities, by the way, solidarity, right? To understand solidaristic practices that can defeat and surmount and sort of transgress the kinds of fears that always mobilize antagonism. So that is also an act of education as well. I think that's the reason, we took the time to share with you our lessons from Bogota and Medellin, because instrumental to those physical transformations, yes, through architecture and all of that and infrastructure, the foundation was really changing hearts and minds and advancing new models of empathy, solidarity and collaboration. So I think that's where our programmatic dimension, Enrique, enters, and how we are designing pedagogy, urban pedagogy, to really visualize those, mutual kind of assets. Because at the end of the day, migrants come with skills, with memories, with histories, with types of practices that I think can augment, can support, the types of efforts that are locally are being advanced locally. So yes, that is to say, major part of our work has been to open that question: can we design mediation, and how that really connects space and program?
I'll just say one more thing about this, and I think it bears mentioning, thinking about the relationship of universities and design studios to sites of need and sites of vulnerability, and the role, again, the kind of epistemic humility that a university researcher or designer needs to take with them when they enter the field. We've been very critical of what we see as kind of one-off culture of universities that sort of descend vertically down into marginalized places and plant their flag and bring all of their knowledge with them, and they see the community as a kind of empty vessel, right? We've been really trying to push against that academic culture and tip that vertical model to a horizontal plane where the university designer researcher is partnering in a horizontal way with the community. And everybody is bringing something to the table, everybody's learning, and then doing things together that neither one could do alone. And so what that does is it sets up potential for contestation between the university and the community. Okay, right? Nobody should be surrendering to the other. It's about the rough road of learning from one another and everybody bringing to the table what they can and together producing something new. The problem with the way universities currently operate is they sort of dip in and out. So a studio, a grant, a class, students arrive, they get all excited, and then they disappear. And the communities are like, wait a minute, where did they go? You know, you told us we have this challenge and this challenge and this challenge. What are we supposed to do now? And you sort of leave communities hanging. One of the things we've really been trying to do with the community stations model is to be there for the long and to build trust over time. And we really believe, and UNAM is in a perfect situation to do things like this, long-term partnerships where you actually over time invest in the community. And that's what changes the perception of the community to the university. It's that you don't disappear, that you're committed over time to improving life together with the community in these places.
Thank you, Fonna. We have 3 more questions, but I want to first introduce Gaby Carrillo, who is already here, part of our team of professors. And I'm going to continue with the questions. There is one by Paola Escobar, and she says, I'm going to read it in Spanish and then in English. So it says, ¿cómo ayuda o perjudica el mapeo de los lugares de conflicto identificados de tal manera de no estigmatizar dichos lugares? ¿Y a qué avanzaría el proyecto en cada lugar y su complejidad específica? Teddy, do you want to answer it? And I can translate.
Sí, todos sabemos que el mapeo es un instrumento de poder. Nosotros queremos operacionalizar, ¿cómo se diría? O tomar esa condición como un instrumento igualmente de poder, pero desde abajo. O sea, a lo que me refiero es que necesitamos visualizar lo invisible, pero protegerlo. Entonces, por eso es que tenemos que también, estamos interesados en crear los sistemas de protección y garantía social, pero sí legitimar cómo lo informal en este caso, cómo los procesos escondidos, que realmente son procesos de opresión y de injusticia, tienen que visualizarse. Entonces el mapeo, la cartografía radical es importante para estas comunidades, pero media vez exista simultáneamente un proceso de garantías para proteger a lo que debe mantenerse a veces invisible. Entonces es una pregunta fundamental. Pero no porque el mapeo es un instrumento de poder desde arriba, no lo vamos a abandonar como un instrumento desde abajo que puede instrumentalizar y avanzar nuevas dinámicas para repensar la jurisdicción, para repensar las políticas urbanas excluyentes, etc. Entonces es un proyecto de counterpower, ¿cómo se diría? Desde abajo, ¿no? So, Fonna, I'm just explaining that it's a beautiful question about, are you vulnerable? When you are actually visualizing and mapping these conditions, is that opens vulnerabilities? And I'm saying, yes, we all know that mapping is an instrument of power, but we are trying to reverse it and engage it as an instrument of counterpower to in fact legitimize a different geographic and cartographic, and that's the reason civic elasticity, that's what we were getting at. El mapeo desde arriba podrá incluir lo jurisdiccional. Nosotros queremos visualizar lo socioecológico primero para poder avanzar una sensibilidad pública transfronteriza y movilizar un liderazgo político diferente, ¿no? Entonces la imagen se convierte en un instrumento político de mapeo, pero con diferentes objetivos. So anyway, so I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Well, just the idea of counter mapping. So we've people have said to us in the past, well, sometimes when you want to visualize what's invisible, you can actually expose people to political danger, right? So when people have alternative pathways and routes to cross borders and so forth, the last thing you want to do is visualize them and bring them into the open. And so there's judgment involved in this. There's a lot of judgment involved in this as well. Like when it empowers and when it exposes and makes vulnerable. So you have to continually keep that in mind.
Y es un tema, rapidito, importante para nuestro trabajo, porque siempre durante los últimos años hemos estado traduciendo y visibilizando, visualizando las dinámicas urbanas desde abajo en barrios migrantes en San Diego, para nosotros representar esa información. Toda la dinámica desde abajo de transformación de espacios para hacerlos más inclusivos, más plurales, de usos mixtos, de zonificación más, de nuevo, porosa. Y con esa información, nosotros la llevamos a las instituciones a tocar las puertas y decir, tienen que cambiar la política urbana. ¿Me entiendes? Entonces hay un proceso de traducción desde el dinamismo de esa informalidad desde abajo y cómo eso viaja a las instituciones para que poder repensar las políticas. Eso necesita mediadores y es ahí donde nuestra práctica entra, creo, donde el mapeo es importante.
Gracias. William, quería preguntar aquí en el Zoom.
Bueno, thank you, Teddy, and thank you, Fonna, for everything, and congratulations. And especially thank you for bringing to the forefront the idea that architecture also has to do with zoning laws and mechanisms for defense, whether it be legal or whichever. I was wondering if maybe I could make a question that is a bit more strictly architectural, because of the problems, well, not problems, but the difficulties our students have been finding when trying to think of architectural interventions that have to do with migration. As Loretta was saying, we're working in Tapachula right now, which has the particular speciality in which the migrant is about to embark on a very dangerous route to go up to the north of Mexico. So I found it very interesting, the little architectural typology you were showing of these hubs in Tijuana. And I was wondering if maybe you could just answer like two very specific things. First, when it comes to architectural function, what are you thinking about these places? I mean, and especially in the parts in where you're saying that they will provide some type of housing in Tijuana, I think it's interesting to think that the migrants here are at the same time wanting to leave because they want to enter the United States, but they also want to stay. So I don't know when you guys were thinking about it, if you're thinking about it as merely a dignified housing or something more. And on that note, what would be, in your opinion, the role of beauty here? And I know it might sound superfluous when we're talking about such precarious of lives, but architecture does have to deal with this. So the second part in which beauty, not just as right, but the beauty of living or the beauty of even moving. I don't know if you considered that in when you were thinking about these spaces in Tijuana. So basically, those would be the two questions. Again, very architectural. I'm sorry, but it's like just function and beauty, and how do you see it in these spaces?
Should I jump on that?
Go for it. Yeah.
Yes, no, fundamental. And you saw our images. I mean, it's not that because we are architects committed to closing the gap between, social responsibility and artistic experimentation. We are committed to that. We are not suggesting that beauty or aesthetics are separate. I think that if anything is to really rethink the hierarchies. I mean, this is not aesthetics for aesthetics' sake. This is an aesthetics that operationalizes pedagogical contents, the way systems are layered and exposed, the way housing is embedded in an infrastructure of support. And all of those conditions are rendered open and visual. And so the social aesthetic here is part of it as well, the working, the kinds of social and economic relations, the kind of materiality, the forms of assembly, So all of those processes are aesthetic as well in architecture frames that. And so I was going to say fundamental to our work is the idea, at least in terms of housing, that housing cannot exist on its own. This is what we already said, that is, but it needs to be embedded in infrastructure of support. And that produces a very interesting aesthetic set of relations. So for example, the second phase for this sanctuary ecological neighborhood that we are engaging in Tijuana, we are very excited by the aesthetic elements of just building a series of plinths and kitchens, and then letting the local labor begin to, I don't want to sound strange here, but when, we have been thinking of this for a long time. I mean, obviously somebody like Alejandro Aravena was able to build it first because of particular conditions in Chile, but we are still critical. I mean, those are still just units of housing. So it's part of still a very neoliberal model of, everybody to fend for themselves. They just fill in, which is it, but nevertheless, it's an aesthetic condition that is actually very interesting. For us is, how do we do that? But in terms of the public realm, can we, in fact, produce a kind of relationship between refugee housing and incremental infrastructure for public encounter, right? So to produce, so that can be an interesting question for the students. And then finally, what you were saying in terms of from Tapachula, I'm from Guatemala, by the way, so this is an interesting topic for me, all the way to Tijuana. Part of the question here is how that transition from ephemerality to permanency, from the ephemeral to the permanent, can produce opportunities here. So that also we can anticipate ways of incrementally grounding and including and people who might want to remain. But on the other, similar to what we share with you about this network of spaces, can we imagine the journey? We've been thinking a lot about this. Can a student in part of your studio, I'm already maybe giving some ideas here, but produce a kind of incredible network of collaboration across the journey with the nonprofits who are engaging, who already have capacities, land, programs, and then you begin to produce a more distributed system, or even designing ephemeral kinds of transitional support systems like backpacks and survival kits, or from point A to point B to point, to analyze the journey, because there are certain segments of that journey that are absent, where there is nothing to support. So then you begin to produce hierarchies and incrementality and intensities that are very different across those temporalities, right? So anyway, all of this comes down to diagrammatics, aesthetics, spaces, processes. So all of that's the reason architecture is such an amazing field, right? So just wanted to say that we believe in the aesthetic of obviously of content of many of these processes.
Thank you. There is one more question, the last one. I don't know if you have time because we only have 3 more minutes according to our schedule, but if you want to answer that, and then that will be the last one, if that's okay.
Of course.
From Cristina Lopez Uribe, professor at the School of Architecture, she asks, which are some strategies to encourage that the inclusion of migrant populations to hosting communities is set in egalitarian terms?
That's a big question. That's not a 3-minute answer. It's a very big question. In many ways, it's the challenge of our time, right? The idea that a migrant should have access, to the resources of the arrival host city. I mean, here again, we're witnessing populist reaction across the world precisely because there's a resistance to thinking about migration in inclusive terms. And so, Teddy and I have always seen this really it really transcends architectural and urban conversations to cultural conversations, changing the narrative about race, about borders, about inclusion, about climate change, which is the driver, is going to be the biggest driver of population movement across national boundaries in the coming period. So these are very large questions. And I think as educators, we are in a good position to help prepare our students for what's coming. I mean, I guess sometimes we feel so helpless in the face of these large questions that we see hope in kindling the enthusiasm of a new generation to take these challenges. It has to begin at the bottom up, right? In changing perceptions. Such a big question. We can't possibly do justice to it in such a short period of time, but it is the question, right? How to preserve democracy in the face of populist reaction against inclusion. I mean, that's ultimately what it is. And we're losing our democracies because of it, right? Because democracy is inherently an egalitarian political position. And there's so much fear of the arriving other that our democracies are being eroded. So it's a big problem.
And that's to be said also, that is to say that while these issues are amplified by the migrant, let's say, situation, they are already present in our cities. Really, I mean, in terms of the incremental socioeconomic inequalities that continue to really, divide our communities across the city itself. So the issue of democracy as an egalitarian concept and how to build equity and how to really produce the type of guarantees are already, again, challenges that we must and should have been engaged in the field of architecture already for years. And I think that that's the reason working with this topic is fundamental, because we can see reflected through it the kinds of urgencies that really are broader and larger, to be rethought. And that's the reason Fonna and I remain positive, by the way, to end in a positive note, that in this, I don't know if we can call it any more post-COVID reality, that as we emerge from this tragedy, and obviously what is going on everywhere in the world right now, in Europe, and unfortunately, we might begin to understand that the survival of the individual depends on the health of the collective, that this is really about restoring some level of civic and public imagination. That notion of the public that we have demonized because of the last years of neoliberal dominance, of hyper-individualism, exclusion, and marginalization through economic power. So I think that it is about new forms of coexistence. And I think that's hopefully it can be something that we as architects can specialize, which is very, very, very difficult. But yes, I think that this is an amazing challenge. This question is fundamental, I think, to end our discussion today, how to construct and democratize the city in years to come.
Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias. Gaby, ¿quieres decir algo?
Ay, sí, muchas gracias, Teddy, Fonna. Thank you very much for being here. Unfortunately, I was connected through Conectafa, but at least I managed to connect through Zoom to let you know that we admire your work, that we are very thankful for having you here in our studio. It is very special for us, for you to share these ideas. And I just want to close saying that these new forms of existence you are sharing with us are great, because it's exactly what we are pursuing in our studio. And thank you very much for your time. Happy to see you, even though through these Zoom scenarios, but thank you very much.
We hope to see you in person soon. We
yes,
love Unam.
please.
We love Unam.
Yes. Please, thank you very much.
Thank
Will,
you.
¿quieres decir tú algo también para cerrar? Agradecer.
Just thank you. And I mean, again, the next year of the studio will have to do with the American-US border, the Mexico-US border. So I hope we can have further collaborations on that front sooner rather than later. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teddy, Fonna, for being here. We do appreciate so much sharing your knowledge with us and your projects, and we will make sure to send you some of the images that will be produced here and to be able to discuss them sometime. Gracias a todos, a toda la Facultad de Arquitectura, a Comunicación, al director Juan Ignacio del Cueto, a todos nuestros alumnos aquí presentes y a todos los que nos escucharon por redes, y obviamente a Teddy y a Fonna por estar aquí.
Gracias a todos.
Muy buena
Cuídense
semana.
mucho.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Saludos al lindo DF.
Claro que sí.